In a basement evidence room beneath a county courthouse, there is a cardboard box marked with a single case number, 87 to 114. Nobody has opened it since 1987. The label has gone soft and yellow at the corners. Someone wrote that number in black marker almost 4 decades ago, set the box on a metal shelf between 24 others just like it, and walked away. The world outside kept moving. The box did not. Inside is a manila evidence envelope, and inside that envelope is a single cotton swab, sealed in plastic, collected from underneath a young woman's fingernails on the last night anyone ever saw her alive. For 38 years, that swab sat in the dark. Detectives changed. Sheriffs were elected and retired. An entire generation grew up in Millhaven Ridge without ever hearing the case discussed as anything other than history, a thing that had happened to people they never knew in a decade that felt more distant every year. The box stayed exactly where it was through all of it, on the same shelf in the same dark. In the winter of 2024, nobody in that courthouse knew the box was about to end something that had haunted an entire town for 2 generations. Nobody knew that 400 miles away, a 58-year-old man was about to hear a knock at his front door that would undo 37 years of careful, deliberate distance. This is what happened when a piece of evidence smaller than a grain of rice finally spoke. Millhaven Ridge sits in a shallow valley where the fog doesn't burn off until almost 10 in the morning. In the summer of 1987, it had 1 stoplight, 1 diner, a weekly paper with a circulation under 3,000, and a population that hovered around 4,000 people who mostly knew each other on site. That August was unusually hot. Longtime residents still bring it up. The asphalt on Route 9 went soft enough to hold a boot print by mid-afternoon, and half the town drove down to the creek behind the old grain mill after dark just to feel something close to cool air. Renee Calloway was 22 that summer. She worked the counter at Millhaven's only pharmacy and kept a nursing school brochure folded inside her purse, creased off for being opened and closed so many times. She hadn't told her mother yet. She wanted the money saved and the application filled out first, wanted it to be real before she said it out loud. Walt Guidry, who owned the pharmacy, remembers her doing register math in her head at the end of nearly every shift, counting weeks of tips against the cost of tuition. He still has her employee time card from that August. He kept it, he says, without really deciding to. She'd grown up 3 streets from the pharmacy, in a house with green shutters her father built with his own hands before he died. Her mother still lived there in 2024. Her younger brother, Danny, was 14 that summer, all elbows, still growing into his height, and Renee walked him to the creek most weekends because their parents worked late shifts at the mill. Her life, that August, was ordinary in every way that mattered. A boyfriend, Tommy Irino, she was quietly thinking of ending things with. A car with a bad alternator she kept jumper cables in the trunk for. A future that was small, specific, and entirely her own. She kept a calendar taped inside her closet door that summer, one of the few personal items her mother has kept in a box ever since. On it, in Renee's handwriting, is a countdown to the nursing program's application deadline. 31 days, crossed off one at a time in blue pen, the last mark falling on August 13th, 3 days before she disappeared. Her mother has said she can't explain why she kept that calendar for 38 years when she gave away almost everything else. She just couldn't put it in a donation box. Renee's co-workers at the pharmacy remember a woman who ran the register with a kind of quick, easy confidence that made the job look effortless. A regular customer, a retired schoolteacher named Iris Boone, told a local reporter in 1988 that Renee had once spent 20 minutes helping her fill out a Medicare form on her lunch break, refusing to take the $5 Iris tried to press in her hand afterward. Iris kept that $5 bill folded in her wallet for years, unspent, as a kind of private memorial. On the second Friday of August, she closed the pharmacy at 9 o'clock, same as always. Guidry remembers locking the door beside her, watching her cross the lot under the one working street lamp. He remembers it because it was the last time. She said she was meeting a friend before heading home. She didn't say who. He didn't ask. It was a Friday night in a town where nothing happened. He would spend the next 38 years turning that goodbye over, hunting for something in her voice he should have caught. There was nothing to find. It really was an ordinary goodbye between two people who expected to see each other Monday morning. Her mother woke at 6 the next day to an untouched bed. At first, no panic. Renee was 22, cell phones didn't exist, and staying at a friend's after a late night wasn't unusual. Her mother made coffee. She sat at the kitchen table and waited, telling herself there was a simple explanation. By noon, the waiting had turned into something else. At 1:40 that afternoon, a passing driver reported Renee's car parked at an odd angle on the gravel shoulder of Route 9, 2 miles outside town. The driver's door was unlocked. Her purse sat on the passenger seat, cash untouched. Her white sandals, the pair her mother would later identify without a second's hesitation, sat side by side on the floor mat, as though she'd simply stepped out of them. No blood, no broken glass, just an unsettling neatness, as though someone had wanted the scene to look calm. Deputy Ray Holcomb, the first officer on scene, wrote in his incident report that the car's stillness bothered him more than any sign of violence would have. That report, case file 87-114, incident narrative, page 1, still exists in the reopened file today. By evening, half the town walked the ditches along Route 9 with flashlights, calling Renee's name in a dry August grass that swallowed the sound and gave nothing back. Danny walked the line beside his father past midnight, refusing to go home, shining a flashlight into culverts. He says he still remembers the crickets never stopped singing the whole time, as if nothing in the world had changed. Search efforts pulled in volunteers from 3 neighboring towns and a handful of state troopers within 72 hours. Dogs came from 2 counties over. Divers checked the creek behind the mill, the same creek Renee used to walk Danny to on weekends. Nothing. 9 days passed with nothing. On the 9th morning, a fisherman named Earl Whitfield left the trail he'd walked for years along the same slow bend of creek water. He later told investigators he almost didn't stop. He had no particular reason to leave the path that day, except that something about the stillness of the woods felt wrong, though he could never explain exactly what he meant by that, not even years later at the diner when people still asked. He found her a little after 7 a.m., in a shallow ravine half a mile off the county road, in undergrowth so thick that search teams had passed within 60 feet of it on 3 separate occasions without seeing anything at all. There was no cell signal near the ravine. Earl ran nearly a mile to the nearest farmhouse to call it in. The medical examiner's report, sealed for decades, later partially unsealed as part of the 2024 reinvestigation, documented evidence of a struggle. It also documented the detail that would matter more than anyone in 1987 could have predicted: trace biological material recovered from underneath Renee's fingernails, consistent with someone she had fought against in her final minutes. The autopsy, performed by a county medical examiner named Dr. Alan Feck, took just under 4 hours. His original notes, handwritten on carbon copy forms that the reinvestigation team had to have specially photographed because the paper had grown too brittle to safely handle, described the fingernail evidence in a single clipped line. 4 material present. Right hand, digits 2 through 4. Recommend preservation. That single sentence, written by a man who died in 2003 and never lived to see it matter, is the reason Gerald Fenmore is sitting in a county jail today. In 1987, that evidence was nearly worthless. DNA testing existed only in narrow, laboratory-bound applications years from being usable in an ordinary homicide case. The sheriff's department did the only thing available to it. Sealed, filed, archived. A note in the file, handwritten by the original evidence technician, reads simply, "Retain pending future testing capability." Nobody in 1987 could have guessed that note would wait 38 years to matter. The investigation consumed Millhaven Ridge for close to 2 years. Tommy Areno was questioned across 2 sessions, totaling nearly 11 hours. He had no alibi for the window investigators cared most about. He said he'd been driving alone after an argument with Renee days earlier, an argument neither of them had taken seriously at the time. For a stretch of several months, a majority of the town believed he had done it. The interrogation room where Areno sat for most of those 11 hours still exists, largely unchanged, in the same sheriff's office building. Detective Voss's handwritten interview notes from the second session. 9 pages, held together with a rusted paperclip that has since stained the top corner of every sheet. Record Areno, repeating the same account almost word for word across multiple hours of questioning. A consistency Voss himself flagged in the margin as either entirely truthful or extremely well-rehearsed. Investigators at the time genuinely couldn't tell which. His car was searched down to the floor mats. His clothing was tested using every method available in 1987. Nothing matched. Without evidence to charge him, investigators let him go, and he spent the rest of his life in Millhaven Ridge as a man half the town still quietly doubted, despite there never being one shred of proof against him. He died in 2011, still telling anyone who'd listened that he hadn't done it. His daughter, born nearly a decade after Renee's death, has said publicly that growing up under a suspicion her father was never even charged with shaped almost every relationship he had left in that town. Friendships that thinned out and never came back. She has said the 2024 DNA match was the only thing that could have cleared his name in the eyes of people who made up their minds in 1987 and never let it go. It is one of the quieter costs buried inside a case like this one. Suspicion can outlive the doubt that created it, and it can outlive the man it attached to, following his family for generations after the truth finally surfaces. A drifter seen near the creek that summer vanished from town within a week of Renee's disappearance and was never located again, despite investigators tracing bus manifests and day labor rosters across 3 counties for the better part of a year. His name appears in the file only once, in a witness statement from a gas station attendant who described him as passing through, maybe a hitchhiker, and no further identifying detail was ever recovered. An older man living alone near the ravine, with a decades-old trespassing charge on record, was brought in twice. His account of that night held up against 2 independent witnesses both times, and he was cleared within a matter of weeks. One of the few leads in the case that closed cleanly. He died in 2004, having spent the intervening years quietly resentful, according to a neighbor, of ever having been considered a suspect at all. In 1989, a man from 2 counties over-reportedly bragged while drunk at a bar that he knew something about the Callaway case. It took investigators the better part of a year to run down his identity through second-hand accounts, chasing the story through 3 different bartenders and a cousin who claimed to have heard it secondhand at a family gathering. When they finally sat him down in 1990, his story collapsed within 20 minutes of basic questioning. He'd never set foot in Millhaven Ridge, and the boast, as far as anyone could later determine, had simply been alcohol and a desire to seem interesting to strangers at a bar. For a few painful months in 1988, investigators also chased a theory that Renee's death might connect to a string of unsolved disappearances reported across 3 neighboring states that decade, a theory driven more by newspaper speculation than by evidence. One out-of-state paper ran a front-page piece linking 5 cases under a single sensational headline, a piece that Voss later blamed, in a private letter to a colleague, for wasting nearly half a year of investigative time the department could never get back. Cross-referencing travel records and case files across jurisdictions ate up that entire stretch before the theory was formally abandoned. Each lead dissolved differently, some over months, some in a single afternoon, but they all ended the same way: nowhere. By 1992, the case had gone formally cold. In the department's final internal memo on the case that year, a single sentence sums up nearly 5 years of effort. All viable leads exhausted, case to remain open pending new evidence. That memo sat in the file, essentially unchanged in its practical meaning, for the next 32 years. Detective Harlan Voss, the original lead investigator, kept a personal copy of the file in his own home after retiring in 1998, unwilling to let it disappear into a cabinet where he feared it would stop mattering to anyone but him. He worked it on weekends for years. Phone calls, chased rumors, letters mailed to out-of-state labs asking whether new technology might someday help. He died in 2016, having never solved it. Those who knew him say it was the one file he carried to the end. For years afterward, the case existed mostly as something Millhaven Ridge told itself in fragments. A name mentioned at high school reunions, a chapter in the county's unofficial folklore, a reason mothers gave their daughters for always saying where they were going. Then, in 2019, something changed that had nothing to do with Millhaven Ridge at all. Investigators in California identified a serial predator dormant and unidentified for over 4 decades using a discarded piece of crime scene evidence cross-referenced against a public genetic genealogy database, the same kind of consumer ancestry site where ordinary people build family trees for fun. The technique worked by matching partial genetic overlap to distant relatives who had voluntarily uploaded their own DNA, then narrowing a family tree down to a single name. The story reached even a town as small as Millhaven Ridge. Danny Calloway, by then in his 40s, read about it in a magazine in a doctor's waiting room and felt something he hadn't let himself feel in years. A real, specific flicker of hope. He wrote to the county sheriff's department that same week, the first of 4 letters he'd send over the following 3 years, asking whether the same method could ever be applied to his sister's case. He got polite, non-committal replies for most of that time. Budgets were tight. Staff were stretched across hundreds of open files. And Renee's case was one of over 200 unsolved cases sitting in evidence storage across the state. That changed in 2022 when the state funded a dedicated cold case unit, 3 detectives, and 1 part-time forensic analyst working out of a converted records room with a single mandate: work through every unsolved homicide and disappearance dating to 1970, prioritized by the likelihood that preserved biological evidence still existed and could survive modern retesting. The unit's first budget request, later made public through a state records disclosure, asked for just under $200,000 for its first year of operation, a figure Nagaraj has since said covered barely a third of what the caseload actually required. Even so, it was more dedicated funding than cold cases in that state had received in over a decade, and the 3 detectives assigned to it were, by their own account, aware from day one that they'd never get through even half the backlog in their careers. Renee's file, 87 to 114, was 31st on that list, prioritized in part because the original 1987 technician's meticulous sealing gave the new team unusual confidence something usable might remain inside. It took 2 more years to reach it. 2 years spent closing 4 other cases and narrowing several more, building the exact institutional muscle the unit would need once box 87 to 114 finally reached the top of the shelf. Of those first 30 cases, 2 ended in arrests. 1 ended when the primary suspect was found to have died years earlier, and the rest remain open today, filed back onto the same shelving to wait for whatever comes next. When Detective Priya Nagaraj opened it in the spring of 2024, she expected little. Most of the cases she'd reopened over the previous 2 years ended the same disappointing way. Degraded samples, contamination, DNA too compromised by decades of imperfect storage to test at all. But the swab in 87 to 114 had been sealed almost perfectly by a technician who, without knowing it, had done everything right for a future he never could have imagined. Nagaraj sent it to a private lab specializing in touch DNA recovery from degraded evidence, a facility that had, in recent years, pulled usable profiles from samples in far worse condition than a 37-year-old fingernail scraping. 6 weeks later, the lab confirmed what she'd quietly hoped for since opening the box: a full, usable genetic profile. The next step was almost anticlimactic given everything leading up to it. The profile went into CODIS, the FBI's combined DNA index system, which cross-references DNA collected from crime scenes and convicted offenders nationwide. Nagaraj has said, in the only interview she's given about the case, that she expected another dead end. Most CODIS searches on decades-old evidence come back empty, because the system only works if the perpetrator's profile already exists somewhere inside it. On a Tuesday morning in October 2024, the notification came through anyway. There was a match. The name meant nothing to Nagaraj at first glance, and it took a second, longer look at the screen before the full weight of what she was reading actually landed on her. It meant nothing to anyone left in Millhaven Ridge either, which turned out to be the most unsettling part of everything still to come. The profile belonged to Gerald Fenmore, 58, living quietly 400 miles away. His DNA existed in Cody's not because of any link to Renee, but because of an unrelated 2015 assault conviction in another state, a conviction that required, under that state's law, a mandatory DNA sample upon sentencing. For 9 years, Finmore's profile had sat in the same national database as the sample from Renee's fingernails, 2 entries a keystroke apart, waiting for someone to ask the right question. Investigators found the piece that made everything click into a far darker shape. In August 1987, Finmore hadn't lived in Millhaven Ridge, but county employment records, subpoenaed as part of the reinvestigation, showed he'd worked a 3-week temporary construction contract on Route 9, less than 3 miles from where Renee's car was found. A payroll ledger from the contracting company, still on file with the state, lists his last shift as August 29th, 18 days after Renee's body was discovered, and his final documented day in the county. He never returned to Millhaven Ridge in the 37 years since. In that time, he built an entirely separate life across 4 states, 2 marriages, steady employment, no criminal record beyond the 2015 conviction that would eventually undo him. Public records show he worked as a warehouse supervisor for 11 years in one state, and later ran a small landscaping business in another, the kind of unremarkable resume that raises no flags on any background check anyone would ever have reason to run. His second wife, reached briefly by a local reporter after the arrest, said she had been married to him for 19 years and had never once heard him mention Millhaven Ridge, Renee Calloway, or any period of his life before roughly 1990. She described him, in the same brief statement, as a man who didn't talk much about the past, a phrase she said she'd never thought twice about until the day 2 detectives showed up at her door. When investigators approached him in November 2024, he said little at first. Court filings note he didn't deny working in Millhaven Ridge that August. What he denied, initially, was ever meeting Renee Calloway at all. The DNA didn't care what he denied. He was arrested on a Sunday afternoon, in his own driveway, beside a lawnmower he'd been using minutes earlier. A neighbor told a local reporter, on condition of anonymity, that he'd always seemed the last person you'd ever think twice about. Nearly the same phrase people in Millhaven Ridge had once used to describe Renee herself. Body camera footage from the arrest, portions of which were later released as part of the case's public docket, shows Finmore setting down a pair of work gloves before allowing himself to be handcuffed, asking the arresting officers only one question: whether his wife would be allowed to know where he was being taken. He said nothing else during the 20-minute drive to the county jail, according to the officers present. The case against him, a single genetic match connecting a 37-year-old crime scene sample to a database entry created years later from an unrelated arrest, was strong enough that prosecutors filed formal charges within months. The lead prosecutor, District Attorney Melissa Caro, said at a press conference announcing the charges that the case represented the clearest example I have seen in 20 years of a career of how patience, more than anything else, eventually delivers justice. She declined to take questions about a possible trial date, citing the ongoing nature of the proceedings. Renee's mother, in her 80s, was alive to see the arrest announced. She'd spent 37 years believing she'd die without a name. A family friend who was present when she received the phone call from Detective Nagaraj has said she didn't cry, didn't ask many questions, and instead sat in silence for nearly a full minute before asking only where he lived now and whether he had children of his own. Danny, 61 by then, has said hearing that name felt less like relief than like grief arriving fresh again, as if no time had passed at all. He has described the weeks following the arrest as harder, in some ways, than the original 9 days of searching in 1987, because for the first time in his adult life, there was a face and a name to direct 37 years of unanswered anger toward, and he wasn't sure what to do with it now that it finally existed. The technology that cracked the case, a database never built with Renee's case specifically in mind, connected almost by accident through an unrelated arrest years later and hundreds of miles away, has become one of the most consequential tools in modern cold case work. Nagaraj describes her job now as a kind of reversed waiting game, sealing away testable evidence and trusting that the rest of the world will eventually, unknowingly, hand her the missing half of the equation. Fenmore's trial is still pending. Prosecutors have said the DNA match, combined with the newly subpoenaed employment and payroll records placing him in the county that August, will anchor their case. His defense has signaled it will challenge the chain of custody on evidence handled nearly 4 decades ago, a fight likely to stretch across years, even with a match this strong at its center. Legal analysts who've reviewed similar genetic genealogy prosecutions in other states say chain of custody challenges rarely succeed against evidence this well documented, but the sheer age of the case gives the defense more room to raise doubt than a more recent crime ever would. For Millhaven Ridge, the legal outcome almost feels secondary to what already happened the moment that Cody's notification landed on a Tuesday morning. For 37 years, this was a story without an ending, a wound the town simply learned to build its life around. Now there's a name attached to it. Whatever a courtroom eventually decides, that fact alone has already changed something here that cannot be undone. Danny says he plans to attend every day of the trial, however long it runs, even if that means taking a leave from the job he's held for over 20 years. He says he owes his sister that, after 37 years of being able to offer her nothing but flowers left at the edge of a ravine every August, a tradition he has continued every single year of his adult life without fail, rain or shine, regardless of who else showed up beside him. His mother has said little publicly since the arrest. Those close to the family say she spends most afternoons on the porch of the house with the green shutters, watching the street the way she has since 1987. Except now, for the first time she can remember, she says the watching feels different. Not lighter, just different, as though one small, essential piece of the waiting has finally ended. The house itself has become something of a quiet landmark in Millhaven Ridge, though almost no one who drives past it every day would ever know why, or think twice about the shutters, or the woman who still sits on that porch most afternoons. The green shutters have been repainted twice since 1987, always the same shade, a detail Danny has said was never a conscious decision on his mother's part, so much as a refusal to let that one small thing change while everything else around it did, year after year, decade after decade. The evidence room that held box 87 to 114 for 38 years still holds hundreds of others on the same metal shelving, each one a family, somewhere, still waiting for its own Tuesday morning phone call. Nagaraj's team keeps working through them, aware that most will likely never produce an answer, and reasonably certain a few eventually will. It is slow, unglamorous work, careful lab requests and database searches that return empty far more often than not. Nagaraj has said the hardest part of the job isn't the cases that stay cold forever. Those, she says, become easier to accept over time. The harder cases are the ones like Renee's, where a name finally surfaces and a family realizes the answer had been sitting in a database, technically retrievable, for years before anyone thought to look. But every so often, on a Tuesday no one saw coming, one of those searches comes back with a name attached, and a family's decades of waiting ends. One detail in the Fenmore file still bothers investigators more than any other, and it's the one piece of this case that DNA alone could never answer. Payroll records confirm he worked the same 3-week contract as at least 4 other men, none of whom investigators believe had any connection to Renee at all. Of those 5 men on that job site, only one left the county 18 days after her body was found and never came back. If he'd been standing on Route 9 that August, watching a routine construction crew load their trucks at the end of a shift, there would have been nothing at all, to tell you which one of them was capable of what happened next. Nagaraj has said she's tried, more than once, to picture that final shift on August 29th. 5 men finishing the same job, shaking hands, saying the kind of easy goodbyes coworkers say when a contract wraps up, one of them already carrying a secret the other 4 would never learn existed, would never even suspect existed for the rest of their working lives. She says it's the image from the entire case file that she can't quite put down, even now, months after the arrest, long after most of the paperwork has been filed and the rest of the unit has moved on to the next box on the shelf. That's the part of this story worth sitting with. Not the DNA, which only confirms what already happened. The part worth sitting with is the 18 days Gerald Fenmore spent in that county after Renee's body was found, working alongside men who had no idea what he'd done, before he packed up and left like nothing had happened at all. What do you think kept him there those extra 18 days, finishing out a job on the same road where a car was found, instead of leaving the moment her body turned up? Was it nerve, arrogance, or simply the calculation that leaving early would have drawn more suspicion than staying to the end of the contract like nothing had happened?